Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining International Bipolar Foundation again for a webinar this week. Today, we're excited to welcome Ron Clark, who's the chairman of Badge of Life, an organization focused on bringing awareness to the crisis of law enforcement, suicide. He's a retired sergeant. And let me go ahead and read off his acronyms, RN, MS, and APSO. Ron, thank you for joining us.
I'm going great to be on.
Okay, so let's just jump into your history, your background, your career. Let's talk about that, and then we'll get into the organization. So go ahead.
Okay. Let's see. My background is I did 4 years in the military. I was an air policeman in the military. I was a canine handler. I got out of the service in the mid 60s. I went to the nursing. I became an RN. Which was unusual back in those days. After that, I decided that I was interested in law enforcement and basically wanted to practice both nursing and law enforcement, which was highly unusual. So I applied to the state police, got accepted, started off in my career as all officers do out in the field, etc. Eventually, I was an old ER nurse, a emergency room nurse, and I'd worked in ICUs and stuff like that. But I felt limited, etc. So once I got into the police work, I did about almost 10 years on the road, did a lot of first aid teaching, stuff like that, and then got assigned to the academy because I had a unique background. By that time, I was teaching a lot of psychological courses and first aid courses and stuff like that, and really teaching literally thousands of cops and troopers and all those types of things. And actually got started as the resource person, support person for policing, law enforcement. This was brand new in the early 70s, starting to support officers that were having issues, whether it was drinking or all types of other things. We did have suicides, etc. And in the course of that, I became more and more the Employees Assistance Program. We had an internal one, and I became the commanding officer, and ultimately got promoted to sergeant, and began to realize that I needed more education. So I went and got a master's degree in counseling, also got a master's degree in education. And I took a course, an advanced course in peer support officer. It took a year. And as I went along, we really were across the country, we were one of the significant programs. I had 5 people full-time working, supporting officers, families, things like that, in really difficult situations, shootings, fatal accidents, the whole bit. Went through 25 years of that particular course, decided that I would retire, went back to nursing, became a psych nurse and a visiting nurse, and spent 8 years doing that. By that time, I had my master's, and also ended up being an oncology nurse in an office and a visiting nurse. So I had a lot of experience in that area, and that took me into the Badge of Life. But maybe the most significant thing for this discussion is that one of my children has bipolar, and he's had it now for 18 years. And that readjusted my whole view on lots of things, people with mental illness. I was always an advocate, always interpersonal relations, all that stuff, but had never had an actual person in my family that had a mental illness of a significant aspect. And so I got connected into the Badge of Life. I did a lot of work in crisis intervention, the CIT programs here in Connecticut. I was the head of what's called CABLE, Connecticut Alliance to Benefit Law Enforcement, was a significant instructor for police officers to begin to get educated on how to handle people with mental illness and how should we deal with them. And I was a strong supporter of that. Now we've got 3,000 officers in Connecticut that have already been trained. So that's kind of my background it's significant. I was on the SWAT team tactical team for 20 years as the advanced life support medic. I'm the senior flight nurse in Connecticut, even to this day. So I've had a varied career, a lot of hats. I was a fireman, a volunteer fireman. I was an emergency medical technician. I was an advanced instructor for EMTs, et cetera, and taught a lot of nurses and even doctors with CPR, et cetera. So very varied. That's my background.
Well, I want to come back a little later about and address the crisis intervention topic, because I think that's very important, especially in today's climate and what we're dealing with. Especially we're in San Diego, we have a similar thing, and we want to connect as a global community, or at least a national community in that. So I want to break for a second and let everybody know that the questions for the Q&A are open. So please submit all questions you have. If you have any about a specific topic, be sure to submit them, and we'll get them answered at the end. So let's move into, Badge of Life. Let's go over the mission, what we're trying to do, what we're addressing, and who we're addressing. And I want to, like I said, address the mission.
Well, the mission of Badge of Life. Badge of Life is probably the most unusual police program in the United States. It's about 12 years old. It was basically founded on supporting officers in times of crisis. One of our emphasis was the prevention of suicide, which is a complicated aspect. But it was to support officers that were dealing with issues like depression and anxiety and PTSD and all these types of things that really are paramount in law enforcement. Badge of Life has, now we've done, we're in our 6th national study. You have to know what you have out there. Law enforcement is very quiet about suicides. They don't say a whole lot.
Right.
The tip of the iceberg. And so we've done 6 studies, national studies, only ones ever done in the world on a nation. And it came up with a number. This last year, it was 140 officers that we can verify committed suicide or died by suicide. And we've tried to be the person that speaks out on the stigma of mental illness. And if you think it's bad in the general population, it's 100 times worse in law enforcement.
Right.
It's really difficult, and we've tried to break those barriers down in a lot of different ways. And we've been I think successful in at least being the speaker and voicing out things that nobody else wants to talk about, is what I'm trying to say.
Right. Absolutely.
And so that's our mission. We deal with families. I converse with lots of police officers across the United States on a daily basis. We get a lot of emails into our website, and we make it a policy to respond to all of them.
Right.
Just in trying to support, we do a lot of articles, but mostly we're the proponents of police officers need more support. They need more types of things where they can allow themselves to emotionally discharge or, in fact, get help when they need it. We're proactive.
Right.
We think that, if you're in crisis, you should have way before that. But law enforcement is a tough nut to crack. There's a lot of percolation across the United States. There's a lot of resistance. But there's a lot of places that are starting to open up. And you mentioned before, Jeff, like CIT. I didn't think I'd live long enough to see a CIT program.
Mm-hmm.
But it's there, and we can talk about that later. It's significant. But it's getting the officers to look at themselves. They see bad things. They see really bad things. They see it every day. Once you've accumulated enough trauma, sometimes things happen to yourself, and depression and all types of other things. And PTSD is rampant in law enforcement. Yet we have a hard time getting anybody to acknowledge that these officers, and many of them die by their own hand, just like the servicemen, they die by their own hand, and everybody, claims that it was marital or this or that or whatever else.
Right.
And so we've tried to focus on the issues, but there's a lot of room for improvement.
Oh, absolutely. So, let's get into maybe not by name, but a specific story where an officer may have come to you in your time as, let's say, before Badge of Life, before that resource was available. Did you run into any instances that really stuck out to you in your time as a law enforcement officer, that really showed the need for an organization like Badge of Life?
Actually, yeah. It goes back many years, and one of the interesting things is that I retired from the state police in Connecticut. I belong to the New England NESPAC. It's the New England State Police Organization, all 6 states in New England. So there was not uncommon to get calls from different officers, troopers, etc., from outside the state of Connecticut. But the one of them that stood out in my mind, has always stood out in my mind, is an individual that in fact had been involved in a shooting in yesteryear. That was way back, and this one was when I met the person. He'd already been on the job 30 years.
Right.
And he told a story. He was a drinker. He had got himself into a jam in the department. They were, trying to deal with him, and a great person. When he was sober, he was a great person, and he was really getting close to going out the side door. And he told a story. I remember I sat down with him, and he told a story about a morning he got up to go to work, and they took cars home in those days.
Mm-hmm.
And his next door down the road neighbor came out, a 15-year-old came out with a 12-gauge shotgun, fired at him 5 times. He was a kid that had some issues, etc.
Right.
And he barricaded himself behind his driver's door, hesitated until the boy was less than 12 or 14 feet away, and ultimately returned fire and killed him. Now, this is what happened after that. Great job. He'd watched this boy grow up. Went to the barracks, did his thing, and for the next 30 years, every night he would argue with the boy in his bedroom, "Why did you make me kill you?" When I heard that, the boy wasn't there, obviously, but he argued and argued and drank and drank. We got him into help, and he went to a clinical psychologist, was in treatment for a long time to dispage and get that out. And ultimately he retired, and he's deceased now. But I remember taking that, and that story could be reproduced multiple times in different situations across the country, of cops that have been involved in situations or other things where in fact they did things or things were done to them. And there's a necessity for badge of life. Like, I got enough scars on me from criticism of why are you guys doing this type of thing? Mm-hmm. Because somebody has to do it. Somebody has to start to destigmatize. There is mental illness in law enforcement, mental illness. We have people with depression, anxiety, panic attacks, right. PTSD, etc. That's a given. And until we recognize that, and until we can start to deal with these officers as human beings, they're good people. Mm-hmm. But until we can deal with them, the job is one of the toughest psychological jobs in the world. We couldn't think of another one, Jeff. We can't think of another one. We can't think of another one in the whole world that's as tough psychologically in a 20 to 30-year career. And so it's to say, look, we need to provide officers with the necessary, and when they do come down with things, we estimate right now that there's 85 to 100,000 officers in the United States, active duty police officers, that have diagnosable PTSD.
Yeah.
85 to 100,000, and we're criticized at underreporting it. Well, I can't prove that. I can't prove it. But that's what we're looking at, 85 to 100,000. That's about 1 out of every 8 or 9 officers.
Right.
And so you sit there, I can prove 140 officers died by the tip of the iceberg.
Mm-hmm.
And so you look at these. I mean, I've had thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of contacts. I talk to cops every day that have severe PTSD. I don't even talk to some of the cops. They text me. They can't talk. They're so isolated. They're so remote. They're in an apartment. They can't even talk to anybody.
Right.
And they were, if you listen to their stories, you'd say, oh my God, these guys are genuine heroes. And then they're discarded, or they just fade away, or they just die.
Absolutely.
We don't even know how many have died of suicide after they retired. It's almost impossible to track them.
Right.
So that's what we're faced with. And you get the doubting Thomases and not this stuff and that and there. It's like a chief of police. Well, Ron, no one's ever come in and told me they got PTSD. Absolutely. Really, Chief?
Yeah.
You go in and tell somebody like that, and in certain areas you can feel the grease right out the door.
Right. And
you got a mental illness.
Right. Well, that actually gets us into another area. I was going to ask you, you were in a position of authority. Have you seen, witnessed, have you felt any pushback by other members of an authority rank within law enforcement? Without getting too specific, I understand, but have you faced that as both, an officer and as an agent of badge of life?
No, let me take the trooper side. Most certainly.
Right.
When I was a sergeant, I reported directly to the Commissioner of Public Safety.
Yeah.
That's how sensitive this stuff was.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in the table of organization. It was forever educating ranking. I knew every ranking officer in the department. We had almost 1,000 troopers, and yet you always had the individuals. The old stigma with mental illness is that person's a weak person. That person can't do the job. That person. And you'd sit there and say, in other words, this person that's been devastated by the incident you know about, and yet now he is having emotional problems. Mm-hmm. He's having, you haven't lived, Jeff, until, once upon a time, we had an officer one time at a very serious accident where the guy was caught in the car. The car was on fire. They mm-hmm. couldn't get him out of the car because it was turned upside down, etc. They used everything, sand, distinguishers, everything. They couldn't put it out. The last thing before the guy died in the car was shoot me to the trooper who was trying to pull him out of the car, and he burnt himself and everything else. Couldn't get him out of the car. Shoot him. And he meant it. And so these types of things, and you say, and this is, I had no rank as sergeant. I'm a nobody. Mm-hmm. But in reality, we were able, some people in authority are, they're lost souls. I wouldn't have a dog work for them.
Right.
Others are great. But as badge of life, I talk to a lot of chiefs. I talk to a lot of good chiefs. I talk to a lot of chiefs, the bell curve. And it's a bunch of crap. PTSD doesn't exist. You can't handle the job drag, you can. This is only for tough people. Well, I've buried enough tough people with suicide and other things that I don't believe that. And I tell it to them, look, when you get to my age, I've seen it all. I'm 74 years old. Mm-hmm. I've seen it all. I haven't missed anything. I've seen all the rats. I've seen all the administrators that couldn't administrate a chicken coop.
Right.
And you say, this is the 21st century. This isn't the 1800s with this stuff. This is the 21st century. We know an awful lot about mental illness. We know an awful lot about treatment. We know an awful lot of what we should be doing, whether it be a police officer or a civilian out there. We know an awful lot. And yet, if we don't institute this stuff, if we don't put programs in place, where else could you train an officer 40 to 60 hours how to fire a weapon? That's a train, about 40 to 60 hours.
Mhm.
Most officers never shoot their weapon, by the way. Very few ever shoot their weapon. And yet we do almost nothing for their psychological aspect as they go out into the most dangerous psychological job in the world.
Right.
Something wrong there. And so we see the ramifications, and we're always, look, I'm from the Vietnam era.
Right.
I came out, I was a trooper by the latter part of the 60s
Mhm.
when we were responding to young males somewhere between 19 to 25, ex-military from Vietnam that had died by their own hand. Everybody just shrugged their shoulders.
Yeah.
So they die. If you're old enough, which I am, I can remember in the latter part of the 40s, my dad worked at a factory.
Mhm.
Had a lot of, damn near everybody in the factory was from World War II, combat.
Right.
Multiple suicides. Multiple. When I was a young kid. I can still remember the door. My father was a union official.
Mhm.
Knock, knock, knock. So-and-so's died by his own hand. A shotgun, whatever. So all of this stuff has been known for every war we've ever been in,
Right.
and everything that we're doing here. And so it's a matter of climbing tortuously into the 21st century and instituting programs for the officers that make sense to support them.
Right.
They're not super, I got to be careful here. They are super people, etc. But they're not Superman or Superwoman. They're human
Right.
beings. And they, in fact, do a tough job, and some of them are taken down by it because they don't have the support systems. They don't have the necessary aspect. And that's a tragedy. It's a tragedy in itself. And so it's a never ending, but we get pushback, not as much as we used to. I often said, Jeff, if you looked at my background, my whole life has been developed to do what I'm doing right now
Right.
with Badge of Life. All the components. I mean, I went to graduate school. They gave me some tests, what I'd be good at. And I was the only one in graduate school. I came up to be a cop and a nurse, and they were equal. So, I practiced it both. I'm still I'm retired as a therapist now, but I'm still active as an RN. And so, these things they make sense. And if I tell the cops, just go on the internet, look around, look at the things that are out there.
Right.
Don't listen to the nonsense. Start to take care of yourself because you're responsible for yourself.
Right.
That makes sense?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, okay, so that leads us into, let's talk programming. So Badge of Life, as an organization, is pushing for support, is pushing for presence, is pushing for conversation. What do you guys see as like the future of instituting programs in law enforcement communities? What do you guys want to do? What do you guys do? What can the community help you with?
Well, I think to start off, the programs, we have a program called Cradle to Grave. From the time you come into law enforcement, besides learning all your police techniques and all that stuff, driving and shooting and all that stuff, you should start to learn about your own emotional wellness. What does that mean? How do you do that? What are the aspects that you should be practicing? Keeping yourself physically and mentally well. Right from day one, hour one, second one in the academy. When you graduate from the academy, it's usually 20 weeks, 24 weeks. You then go to an FTO, a field training. I was a field training officer before I did what I did in the state police. You get an FTO. Well, now we have FTOs. There's a training program. One of our board members, he's a clinical psychologist. It's a 5-day program for FTOs to be trained to be a field training officer. All cops have to go through it.
Right.
Before they can go out actually on the job by themselves. They have to be with an experienced officer. And they train the future FTOs in just what you and I are talking about here. How do I support the newbie? that just got out of the academy.
Right.
Most newbies have never seen it unless they've been in the military. They've never seen a dead body. They've never seen hardly anything. They're between 21 and 25 on an average. So the FTO is present when they see bad things, fatal accidents, suicides, domestic violence, child abuse, the whole bit. And it's how you handle them right from the beginning. If you just stand there and say, hey, kid, suck it up. If you can't handle the job, drag your can. What they're saying, suppress it, push it down, don't talk about it. It'll go away. It doesn't. And so I think they've done 800 now. But what they found out, Jeff, cops are very smart. They're very smart. They have to be.
Right.
In the classes, they're usually 25. The first class she did, she's cool. She's really cool. Marla Friedman. She's been doing with cops for 35 years. They wouldn't know how they're going to react to this. Well, this is what happened. They couldn't shut them up. The cops started talking about everything. Now they want more time in the class. They usually do 6 hours. They want more time because they need this to help the newbie to get where they need to go to start them off in their career the right way, not the old-fashioned way. Sometimes the old ways don't work so well. And so as they get into their career, our thing is that every department should be running programs in services. All departments have to have in services for cops for recertification.
Right.
So there should be an ongoing aspect about your own physical and emotional wellness. What does that mean? How do you accomplish that? What are the things you should be doing? And who's responsible for it? Remember I said in the beginning, the officer is responsible for themselves, period.
Right.
With support from others, departments, etc. If they don't take responsibility, you kind of sit there and say, I don't know what you're thinking. In our 2012 study, suicide study for the United States, 85% of the officers died and nobody saw it coming. They went home and killed themselves. Nobody saw it coming. So unless we can engage the officer in their own well-being, the easy one is the fitness side. I was a fitness instructor too. Is, okay, you're overweight. Who's responsible? Well, you're the one putting the spoon in your mouth.
Right.
Unless you got a metabolism problem, which most people don't have when they're 21. You got to watch what you eat, what you this, that, and everything else. The emotional side. That side's more difficult. Well, I haven't got time. I can't do this stuff. I can't walk. I can't do this. I can't do wellness. I can't do because I'm too busy. Well, you got to make time. You got to start thinking of yourself.
Right.
It's always what I say. I'd say it to you, Jeff. Tell me what I'm thinking in the next 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What was I thinking?
Just
no
not.
idea.
No idea.
I was thinking of an orange. So the guy that's going to go home or a woman that's going to go home and kill themselves, unless we can activate them, unless we can get them to say, look, I need help.
Right.
I need help here. Versus, oh, shit, if I say anything, I'm sorry. If I say anything, I'm going to lose my job.
Sure.
They're going to get rid of me. Oh, my God, he's got depression. Well, guess what? We got plenty of cops that take medication for depression.
Right.
And high blood pressure. Nobody gets excited most of the time about, those things. But you kind of say to yourself, we're in this 18th century to a point with mental illness. And you say, okay, how do we make this work so that this whole person, because you do want a person out there in society as a cop with good characteristics physically and emotionally. That's a given. And so these are the things, and as we go along, there's life after law enforcement. So as you're training, the police officers retire moderately early. Most of them are out of law enforcement with an exception by the time they're 55. They're retired. If they come in at 21, they do 30 years, they're going to be 51. So it's not like, and some retire at 25 years. So it's not like they're going to be a cop forever. It's a young man. It's a young person's job. And you say, look, it's physical, it's this, it's that, it's more psychological. but you have to be at the top of your game. Society requires that. And so we take them to retirement. Okay, you're getting close to retirement, and I hate my job, but I got to stay. That's what you hear sometimes from cops. I can't leave because of the pension. Okay, so now you spend the last 5 or 10 years of your career, and you don't like what you're doing, you hate it, this, that, and everything else, and you say, wow. Well, there's a new phenomenon going around. Pension systems are changing everywhere. Defined pensions are going out the window. The 401ks are coming in. What do you think the young cops are saying? I got a 401k. Maybe I'll move on to another department. I won't lose my pension because it's a 401k. And I talked to a cop the other day. In fact, I was just thinking when I talking here. He says, yeah. He says, if I don't like here, I'll apply to another department. I'll carry my 401k with me and go work over there versus I can't leave here because I got a pension. So there's going to be a lot of discussion in the 21st century about retention of officers. We're having a hard time right now getting officers. They're not applying. They're not applying. They just aren't applying. So anyways, that's what we said. We also profess, and this is where we were heretics, that every officer in the United States should go for an annual check-in, not for a fitness for duty, but see a licensed mental health provider, just to check in with him. How you doing, Ron? Are you okay? What's going on with your life? Do it before you need it. Be proactive, so that when you run into something where you really need to deal with it, talk about it, you got something that we call it on our tool belt. You can call whoever, a social worker or a licensed professional counselor or a psychologist or whatever, to go in and talk, because cops are reluctant to enter into those things. They're just reluctant. And we've been trying to break those barriers down so that, hey, go in and talk to the doctor, go in and talk to the social, go in and sit down, close the door, HIPAA falls down behind you. You're not going to get the information like you would for my heart condition or something. It's a hell of a lot harder to get information from a mental health provider than from a regular MD. So but there's always this story. The chief's going to find out. What they're really telling you is they don't want to go.
Right.
That's their denial. That and they're fearful. They're fearful they'll lose their jobs, but they shouldn't be.
No,
they shouldn't. There should be this is not just cops. It's firemen. It's paramedics. It's EMTs. It's dispatchers. All the first responders should be entering in to support programs. Why would I send you into a mess and then step back and not support you? That don't make any sense.
Absolutely. So I think that begs the question, how do we as mental health organizations, how do we get peer-to-peer support to be something that's commonplace? We hear frequently about stories from veterans who suffer from, different mental illnesses.
Yep.
I didn't find any support amongst, my fellow soldiers or officers or whatever it is. And so it just spiraled. How do we inspire that when, like you said, they're afraid of the chief who, afraid of losing their job? But what if their friend, their buddy is the first one to tell the chief, Ron came to me and told me that he's suffering with depression. I don't think that's safe. How do we break down that stigma amongst peers?
I think it's one, like, I've been a peer support officer now for 45 years.
Mm-hmm.
I think peers are absolutely essential in law enforcement and in civilian life.
Mm-hmm.
Peer to peer. Someone, it's, again, Jeff, it's always early aspect of can I talk to someone?
Right.
I'm not doing so good here. Rarely do we ever, it's even when you go for a check-in or whatever, and the classical warnings from the therapist, if you're going to harm yourself or someone else, or you committed domestic violence or child abuse or any of that stuff, I'm mandated to report type thing.
Right.
Peers are the thing, but peers say that right off the bat. Peer police officers say that right off to their person. Look, I'm mandated to. So we're not. If you got those issues, we need to send you elsewhere. But the peers work. I've always looked at how do you get someone who, in most cases, Jeff. Remember, I go back to the 85 that just went home and killed themselves, the 85%, 2012. We think that there were subtle signs. Everybody knows the troubled officers in their department, but they don't do anything.
Right.
Now they're starting to do that. Now, peer support officers, more and more officers are becoming peers. They're taking the training. They're not therapists. They're just another officer that's available. It's like somebody comes to you and they're really in harm's way. And you say, look, I really think you should see someone. You really need to see someone before you really get into real issues. Now, we even see it now with buddy systems. This is a cool one. Remember when you were a kid, when you went swimming, you had your buddy. The buddy went in with you when you swam. The buddy came out with you when you came out of the water.
Right.
Now we're saying officers should have buddies too. Pick your buddy in the department. Pick somebody you trust, somebody you know, that when you're really all over the place, or that you can at least talk to, getting them to where they need to go if that's the case. Well, I can't go to a therapist. Well, I know the places you can't get it. You can't do it at a bar. You can't do it with drugs, and you can't do it with sex. I just named the three things that are going to get you fired in law enforcement. So we got to start thinking outside the box of how do we do these things? How do these peers get it? It works. Great programs. The Pennsylvania State Police has a member assistance program. They got 5,000 troopers.
Right.
I went over there in the early 80s to help them, begin that process. Now it works. It's all over the country, those types of things. But the thing that we're still resistant, Jeff, is that officers are resistant to do a lot of things because they're fear I'll lose my job. And the reason, there's no workman's comp. Okay, so you got PTSD, so you got it on the job. Okay, right. I'm in a state where it doesn't cover PTSD. Okay, now what are you going to do? Not covered. You're naked. You can't work. Oh, if you can't come back to work, then either you got to resign or I got to let you go.
Right.
No cop wants to be fired, so they I had to testify out in Colorado a couple of years ago. They finally got their workman's comp for PTSD and other illnesses, and I did some research. Germany, 1885 was the first workman's comp. Came to the United States in 1911. 1911. This is workman's comp for injuries, etc.
Right.
The last state in the United States was 1947. That was the last one that accepted workman's comp, injury on the job, physical injury on the job. And so you say it's a slow process. Well, Jeff, if you look at 1980, when they finally said, there's such a thing as PTSD. We like to call it PTSI, injury, not disorder.
Right.
We tried to get the DSM-5, American Psychiatric Group, to call it an injury rather than a disorder. There was Badge of Life and the U.S. Army. We both lost. They said, nope, it's going to be a disorder. Because cops and soldiers would accept it. It's actually an injury in the brain. It's a chemical injury up there.
Right.
But those types of things, when you look at it and you say, if you break your leg on the job, you're going to get covered. But if you come down with a quote mental illness, we don't even though it was caused by the job. And
right.
and you kind of say to yourself, That sounds more like the 19th century, way back, way before either one of us, with cancer. When you had cancer, you stayed at home in the back room and you died. Or the kids that were intellectually challenged were just in a closet somewhere. Right. Today, that would be unthinkable, that they wouldn't be in school. Is that a safe statement? Unthinkable. And so this stuff takes time to move forward. I'm an impatient person. So it's been now 1980, it's been 38 years.
Right.
38 years, and we're still talking about PTSD when I went into DSM 3, DSM 3. 38 years. And we still have chiefs, that doesn't exist.
Right.
They're faking it. Well, you talk to any reputable therapist that's trained in PTSD, the PTSD and trauma and stuff, and it's almost impossible to fake. It's almost impossible. But when I'm lecturing, I always tell the people, I can fake a back injury easy. 12 weeks. You'll be out of work 12 weeks. I don't care how many MRIs you do, how many CAT scans you do. You may not find any broken bones, anything in the back other than muscle pull, which is very difficult to find.
Right.
So if we're going to say they're faking it over here, I wonder if they're faking it over on the other side. But nobody questions the 12 weeks for the back injury.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? The stigma.
Right.
And
exactly.
so but it's a process. Colorado, as I said, got the PTSD covered. Maine just got it covered. So many of these states in the United States, far too many don't cover it, but many are now, the parity. Remember that old thing, parity for mental illness that everybody fought for the last 50 years? Oh, we don't cover that. Oh, your insurance, we don't cover those things. They told us it was all parity, and we're still looking to say, well, when are you actually going to institute it so we see a equal for people with mental illness versus people with physical injuries?
Right.
And that's a slow process. It's very slow in law enforcement. I know many officers I've spoken to that resigned rather than get fired because they weren't covered by anything.
Right.
And here they are out there suffering from a job-related injury. And you think about it for a second, you say, my God, that's like medieval almost. So does that make sense to you?
Right. And it's an interesting dichotomy between instituting programs like CIT, which address, the community at large, and then, to have a very, I don't even know what you would call it, kind of an ignorance towards PTSD or other mental health crises that happen amongst law enforcement agents. So I do want to talk for a bit about CIT, about how that's applied, about, maybe a story about how it actually is, making a big, big difference and how we can apply it elsewhere in the entire country.
Yeah, CIT is the crisis intervention training, has been around now for probably close to 15 years. Came to Connecticut back in 2006 or 8 or whatever. It as I said earlier in this conversation, I never thought I'd see this in law enforcement.
Right.
Taking, for example, and I taught a lot of courses. I was the head of the organization that ran the courses for about 10 years. I was part of Cable until I ultimately had to make a decision. I was chairman of both Cable, Connecticut Alliance to Benefit Land, and Badger Life. So I picked the national side, but the program is so significant that when you really look at it for 5 days, and you watch the officers come in, some come there voluntarily, others come that are pushed there by their chiefs,
right?
And everybody sits in the room now, looking to see now what's going to happen here. Everybody has misconception of mental illness and all that stuff, and then it starts. And then the officers get exposed to real people with mental illness, real human beings that sit up in front of them And they talk about themselves, whether they have bipolar, or we had one with paranoid schizophrenia, or a multitude, really courageous individuals. And then all of a sudden, somewhere around day 3, it dawns on the officers that their wife has depression, their son might have bipolar, their daughter has something else. They know people that have it, and all of a sudden, the ones with the folded arms in the back of the room, tell me something I don't know. The third day, it dawns on them. And they start to look at this, and by the time you get to the 5th day, they go out in the door and they become the individuals. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. They become the individuals, the protectors, out on their patrols. They begin to look closely at individuals, whether it's in cities or towns or whatever. And they take a responsibility. My son's an emergency room physician. He's an assistant director. So he works very closely with CIT personnel in a fairly large city. And it's a good relationship because most of the time when the cops come in and say, look, Doc, you got to keep this person because they can't go back out on the street. They're going to hurt themselves. They're going to do something stupid. And he listens very closely. But you ask for an incident, and I'll get personal. My son's life was saved by a CIT officer.
Right.
In the worst time where he was about as far down as you could go and still be alive. And actually, it was 2 CIT officers. And they didn't know me from beans. They did not know me because they'd been trained before I came into the cable side.
Right.
And so my son's alive today because of it. So I'm a supporter. But the son that was in the drugs is now a social worker, licensed clinical social worker, who does and works with individuals and works around CIT officers. So, and I've seen 101 examples of how we can, in the CIT training, and people have a misunderstanding of cops. Cops are trained a certain way for a lot of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But they're also now trained to lower their voice, back up, be less threatening, talk clearly to the person that you're talking to get eye contact, to figure out what's going on. And it works. It works. But always with the premise that the officer's safety is paramount. And these officers, I think, it's remarkable how many lives they've saved.
Right.
Just by their abilities. And if I had my way, you don't have to train every single officer, but you have to have them in the department on all shifts, like specialists.
Right, right.
But their effect on individual, for example, back to my son. He went into a 7-Eleven store. We have a lot of them here in Connecticut. He was in total mania. Took a bag of potato chips. It was $1.59 and left the store. The owner called the police. The police came down. He wanted my son arrested. The one cop this was a third CIT trained officer. Guess who paid for the potato chips? He didn't know me from beans. Wasn't
right.
A cop to cop thing. It was, he gave the guy $1.59, took my son to the hospital and got him admitted because he was completely
right
off the thing. Now, for most people, that wouldn't mean anything. But if you've ever, and my son got it jammed in, he never got, jail or any of that stuff, but he got jammed in the criminal justice system.
Right.
So by being able to channel and get them to help rather than to get them into a system, justice system that just grinds them to pieces. And that's what these CIT officers are doing. You're real human beings. We got our toughest guy in Connecticut. He's 35 years on the job, Jeff.
Uh-huh.
He scares me. He's all muscle. He's an old timer, old school.
Right.
Guess who talks to all the young kids, and they all go to the CIT program.
Mm-hmm.
The old timers telling them it's your responsibility, it's your patrol. If you see somebody talking to a mailbox, you need to go over there and see what's going on.
Right.
This is the guy that gets coffee or whatever. He's a beat cop. He knows everybody on his beat. He knows everybody with mental illness. When they're off kilter, hey, Charlie, I'm just using that name. Hey, Charlie, you okay? And the head goes, no. You want to go up to the hospital? Maybe get checked out? The head goes, yes. In the old days, you would have been rolling on the ground with 3 other cops.
Right.
Then you just walk them up, or they get a patrol car, and they get them to the hospital. They get checked out. Sometimes they get admitted, sometimes whatever. That's the new way. That's the new way. Sometimes they just act certain ways that are safe. Guys, we found out that people with mental illness are no more dangerous than the average citizen.
Right.
Yet if you look at the paper and the news, you'd think, my God, they're all out there killing everybody. Not true.
Right. Right.
So the cops, see, what I'm trying to say in my roundabout way is a cop is an authority figure. There's an authority. But they also have a side of them very few people really want to look at it, is they actually do care. And I'll tell you, there's a program being given out in the Midwest now. It's a Nobility course for law enforcement. It talks about it's an interesting course. I've talked to 3 of their instructors and about the nobility of policing. If you go back to Plato 2,000 years ago, in his society there was individuals that were called guardians. They protected the laws and they protected the people. They were the best people for both those jobs. They'd give their life for their citizens back in those times. Fast forward it, and right here in my town, there's 2 cops on patrol. The guardians are out there right now.
Right.
And cops themselves, we all hear about things. But if you look at the kindnesses that they actually do, the things that nobody ever sees them do, and I've known tens of thousands of cops, and I've been out long enough now. But you say that's why the emotional wellness is so important in law enforcement. You want an officer that's both physically and emotionally well. As this book that these cops get that take this nobility course get, the day you join law enforcement, you no longer have an option. You have to keep yourself physically and mentally well. End of story. Right. To be ready to serve, to do all those types of things. And so it's, and I'm looking forward. We're trying to get it to come here to Connecticut. But the woman officer that does parts of it, they have them read parts of the book that they get. They can't shut them up, Jeff. They can't shut them up. When they start talking about what is your role in society, it's to protect and serve. End of story. Not to be a Gestapo, not to go out there to harm people.
Right.
And so I'm a community-based. I was the chairman of my police commission in town for 12 years. Mm-hmm. And I'm a community-based person. Right. Officers should be community-based. If you want to be a Gestapo, go someplace else. If you want to, there's times and places, but normally the officers should be community activated, community orientated, all those types of things, and society should expect that. End of story. And so, but there's things happening now, just like I said, with people with mental illness. As this CIT program goes across the country, as it continues to grow, this is standard now. Places that don't have, we just say the chiefs of police that don't have it, you're looking for a liability.
Right.
No training is no defense. If that person, but what the officers find out, Jeff, is that in fact it helps them also. It helps them with their family relations, with their children. They pick up skills they can use in their own personal life, but it also helps them. Retreating is kind of a unthinkable for cops. They want to go forward, they want to charge in, and sometimes you got to stop and back up and lower your voice with the autistic kid who left home and is now lost, and the cop's trying to tell him something, he ain't listening. Now the cop's mad at him, and the whole thing. Versus, what am I dealing with here? Take the time, as long as it's safe. What am I dealing with? And then all of a sudden you say, I got somebody here. I got to go slow here.
Right.
And that's the beauty of this whole thing. And I mean, it's just here in Connecticut, just the preventable things that have occurred where somebody maybe has a knife. It's not really, it's a knife, but it's not it's a knife. And you talk them out of it. Drop it. Just put it down. They're afraid. They're scared. They, put the knife down. And they put it down. Without putting it down and moving forward, God knows. So it's been proven. It's proven itself. It has proven itself over and over. As we say to chiefs of police in Connecticut, my God, your best PR is when you go into events where they come out successful and nobody gets injured, etc. You look good. Versus you go in and people get injured, almost always in those cases, and you say, but it takes time, it takes effort. You got to send them to school. They have to get trained, just like you get trained with a firearm. You have to get trained. Some people have to get trained so that you can deal with people with some form of mental illness,
right?
And or someone that's suicidal. Years and years and years ago, in one of the states here, there was an incident where the kid was going to jump. He was threatening to jump, and the officer looked at him and said, "Hey, kid, if you're going to jump, jump." What do you think the kid did? He jumped.
Right.
And you say, not a good approach.
No.
So to me, you'd have to sit through the classes and to see the awakening of officers, senior officers awakening that, oh my God, here's a program, and these are the people, and it's really, it's a sight. It's a sight. And I used to tell my story with my son's permission. And all of a sudden, the Sergeant Clark, would say, "Hey, look, guys, this works. It works. It might be another cop. It might be a fireman. It might be almost, and it's somebody."
Right.
Take your oath of office. You're supposed to protect and serve all people, not just select people.
So we did get a question though about the training program, and we're short on time, so I might just submit the questions to you electronically, and then we'll just answer them that way and publish them. But is the material of the course, is that published work? Because you mentioned a book, and we do have a question about the materials used. Are those kind of private to the training course, or can people access those?
You can go to the CIT program. First, you have to find a program, and then all I have to do is talk to the head of it if you want to take a look at the program. You can't reproduce it because most of it is protected, but you can read it.
Sure.
It's not confidential or any of that stuff. It's just it lays out most now don't. They use fobs. They use those little fobs. They give all the cops, attenders, they just give them a fob, and they can put the fob in their computer and look at the whole course. Yeah. But it's not confidential or any of that stuff. And they're most of the individuals are more than willing to talk about it. They go out and do lectures. They do a whole bunch they do community-based, walks for mental illness and other types of things. So, like I'm a chairman of our mental health board here in my region.
Right.
And so, we do a lot of work, and we have cops on our board of directors and stuff, and it's assimilating them in so that in fact we can get not only their viewpoints, but we can also, see if we can get across our ideas. And so we've got a couple of cops, and we have a drug problem here in the East Coast, so there's a lot of opiates and stuff like that. But it's assimilating, Jeff. The thing I forgot with the CIT course, and this is important, I keep saying cops. There's more than cops in the course. There's psychologists, there's social workers, there's probation officers. There's a whole ton of people that come to the course, mostly to cross-fertilize ideas. So now it's not uncommon for a police officer to contact a mental health professional that they've met in the class for a week and say, hey, I got an issue here with somebody. Could I ask you a couple, some questions? What should I do? What should I not do? Many of them come from their own towns. Many of our towns now in Connecticut, this is unbelievable. They work inside the PD. There's 2 clinicians in 3 of our cities. They work in the police department. They're not paid by the police department. That's paid by the state. But they work in the police department. They go on patrol. They go to crisis intervention aspects. And then they do the follow-up at the emergency room and beyond. It's incredible. And the cops are, and these folks are clinically, so they educate their officers. They educate on this and that. And it's like a team approach. And so when they all go to the emergency room, this is really great. When they all go to the emergency room, the cop, the paramedic, the social worker, etc., and they're all up there talking to my son, the emergency room doc, that we really need to deal with this. We really need to get help for this person. It's cool. Versus you're out in 2 hours, and then you really get into a jam, and now you're arrested. It works, and it's humane, and all those things. So, anyways, that's my comment.
So, before we go, I want to ask you kind of a personal question on behalf of our organization, and we do have a member of NAMI in attendance today. How can our groups, organizations that specify in education partner with Badge of Life, partner with a CIT type group to really forward this message? What can we do? Because I think that's important for anybody from an organization watching.
Yeah, I think I used to be on the Connecticut's state board of directors of NAMI, so I'm a big supporter. Our CIT here in Connecticut was worked with the cable, worked with the NAMI group. I think it is to me is to make contacts, to see where they can fit in. I think there's a great opportunity. We had, her name was Louise Pyers, used to work for NAMI here in Connecticut. She was a clinician, and she was one of the founders that started the cable. And she worked very closely. She did the law enforcement side and all that stuff. But it's getting the barriers down, getting people to cross-exchange ideas, not just say those cops are a bunch of rats, and vice versa. The cops saying, oh, God, here they come. But to get communication so that I think NAMI's done a wonderful job. They've always been a strong supporter of the CIT. So to me, it's almost like you'd want to have seminars where all these different characters would be in the same room. And we find out, at least in the CIT program, that a lot of times the social workers don't know what this people does. The cops don't know what the psychologist does. Nobody really understands the role of the other person. And then they hear it in these classes, and all of a sudden you say, wow, they could be helpful to me. They could help, etc. I know NAMI does a lot of educating in Connecticut in this area of CIT. They've done a lot of what do you call it, public relations stuff. They get a lot of information out, and they've been a proponent that departments, police departments, the other phenomenon is occurring with CIT is we just trained in Connecticut here. We just trained our first group of firefighters, paramedics.
Right. Oh.
Our CIT trained now, and so they're in many cases for your listeners that there's excited delirium from the PCP, et cetera, where they need these individuals have to be medicated as soon as possible so they don't harm themselves or anyone else. Well, the paramedics now are starting to do that in the big cities. We got Sergeant here in Connecticut. She's an expert with excited delirium in a big city, and so all of these things are beginning to gel, and I think that groups like NAMI and others, it's a supportive role. We find that most of or many of our programs that have been started in Connecticut, there's been, let's just say, a nudging from parents who have loved ones that have issues.
Mm-hmm.
All our colleges now, all our universities in Connecticut have CIT trained officers.
Right.
Now we have groups, and this is the beauty where the NAMI has gone in with support groups. So your son or daughter goes off to college. My son had his breakout in his senior year. He was the captain of the basketball team. He was accepted to medical school. His doctor, he was following his brother.
Right.
When he had his first episode. They didn't know what the hell at his college, didn't have anybody trained. Now parents willingly go to many of these groups and give information on their loved ones of what they have. So that when they get called to the dormitory at 2 o'clock in the morning, if you don't have any information and somebody's acting out, you can see bad things happening, can't you?
Right.
If you know who you're dealing with, and they're starting to now, the support systems, the whole 9 yards. So if you go to any of our colleges in Connecticut, where we see a high percentage of first, especially for bipolar, first time away from home, et cetera, and issues start. So and we're not the only state that, but you get my point. It's a movement. NAMI's been NAMI, the university administrations have been very supportive in these areas. Plus, they've been nudging. You really need to train the office. In most universities, they're all trained. So it's not a matter. If we had enough time, I could tell you the horror story with my son in the beginning. But it was from individuals that didn't know what they were doing. Right. Didn't really care. And you'd say an idiot would know what was going on. Sure. But and maybe Jeff, maybe it's for another time. It's like you'd say, here I'm an RN, graduate degree in counseling. Mm-hmm. Till it happens to one of your loved ones, you ain't lived through this at all. You can see all the psych patients you want until it's a loved one where you probably agree bipolar can be moderately complex. Hmm? And yet my son is a living example, and he's fostered that there's life after. He has 2 children. He's married. Mm-hmm. He has his little bumps in the road, but he got on with his life. But he had support. Right. And he, and he's more public, and he's a professional, and he's very good at what he does. When he had a little bump a while ago, when he was only for seasonal change and stuff, but when he wasn't at the office, all of his clients said they'd wait for Paul to get there, so they just waited for him to come back. So he's a very courageous individual, I've always said to others, and I've known many others, you're a living example that you can live with this, and you can get on with your life, and you can adjust your life, and we got to get away from this just name calling and this stigmatizing, and say, look, we don't do this if you got a heart attack, and but it's going to take, and NAMI's done that, and other individuals have done that. This is not closet material. There should be a hot light on this.
Oh, absolutely. And
education. So anyways, that's my pontificating.
Well, and I think that's a good place to leave it open to the future. So, I mean, I think our audience and I think our followers who, really need to hear a lot of this information would love to have you back. So, thank you for joining us today for a fantastic, fantastic talk on a topic that, we won't let go. We will continue to have.
Good.
So,
Good.
So thank you, Ron. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for the opportunity.
Oh, absolutely, and thank you for everybody for submitting questions. What we're going to do is I will submit them to Ron, and we will post them on the website for everybody who didn't get their questions answered today. And so let's see. All right, we're going to close down the webinar. Thank you again, Ron.
Okay.
And everybody have a terrific day.